Nestled in the heart of an unassuming rural town, there lay an expanse of cornfields that locals simply called the fields. Stretching far beyond what the eye could see, the plantation was a sea of golden green stalks swaying under the wind's gentle command. For decades, the fields have been a source of pride and livelihood for the town, their harvest feeding not just bellies but also community spirit. Yet, for all its bounty, the fields carried a weight of silence, a peculiar stillness that seemed to hum with an unspoken secret. Eleanor Harper, a newcomer to the area, purchased the plantation after its previous owner vanished without a trace. The circumstances surrounding the sale were peculiar, rushed, almost desperate. But the price was irresistible, and Eleanor, seeking a fresh start, jumped at the opportunity. A widow in her early 40s with a teenage daughter, Claire, she saw the fields as a chance to rebuild their lives. But even on her first day, as she surveyed the land from the porch of the weathered farmhouse, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Local lore was rich with whispers about the fields. Townsfolk spoke in low voices about strange happenings. Lights flickering in the distance during moonless nights, rustling sounds with no wind to move the stalks, and an unsettling sense of disorientation for those who wandered too far into the rows. Eleanor dismissed these stories as rural superstitions until the whispers began. The first occurrence was subtle. Claire, while exploring the edge of the cornfield, swore she heard her name carried on the wind. Eleanor, it had breathed, soft and lilting, barely distinguishable from the rustling leaves. She laughed it off, but Claire's face remained pale, her hands trembling as she clutched the hem of her jacket. That night, as the family settled in, Eleanor heard it too, a faint murmur that seemed to originate from the corn. The following days only deepened the mystery. Eleanor noticed oddities in the land. Rows of corn appeared to shift positions overnight, leaving clear pathways one moment and impenetrable walls the next. Small trinkets, an old pocket watch, a rusted key, a broken locket, began to appear on the farmhouse porch without explanation. Each item was caked in dirt, as though unearthed from deep below. One evening, Eleanor invited the town's eldest resident, Mr. Abernathy, for tea, hoping his years might shed light on the strange occurrences. His face grew grave as she recounted her experiences. "The fields remember," he murmured cryptically. "They hold on to what's lost and sometimes what's taken. Best not to pry too deeply, Mrs. Harper. Some secrets are meant to stay buried." Undeterred, Eleanor decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight and notebook, she ventured into the corn under the cover of twilight. The air felt heavier there, as if pressing against her skin. The further she went, the louder the whispers became, forming an eerie, unintelligible chorus. She paused to take notes, but her pen slipped from her hand as a sound, a low, guttural growl, emanated from the darkness. Panic bubbled in Eleanor's chest as she turned back, realizing she had no clear sense of direction. The rows of corn stretched endlessly, identical and unyielding. Her flashlight flickered, plunging her into temporary darkness. When the beam stabilized, she saw it, a figure standing between the stalks. Its outline was human, but its proportions were all wrong. Limbs too long, head tilted at an unnatural angle. Frozen with fear, Eleanor stumbled backward, her foot catching on an exposed root. When she looked up again, the figure was gone. The whispers, however, had grown deafening, their tones sharp and accusing. It wasn't until she blindly sprinted in a random direction that she burst out of the cornfield, gasping for air and collapsing onto her porch. Claire found her there moments later, trembling and clutching her notebook. Though she wanted to reassure her daughter, Eleanor couldn't bring herself to speak of what she'd seen. All she could do was glance back at the fields, where the rows now stood eerily still, as though mocking her escape. The land, it seemed, had made its first move. Eleanor awoke the next morning to find the notebook from the previous night resting on the kitchen table. She hadn't remembered placing it there. The pages were damp, the ink smeared, but what disturbed her most was the addition of a single sentence she hadn't written. "They're waiting for you." She glanced outside at the fields, now basking under the warm light of dawn. They looked almost serene, the golden stalks swaying gently in the breeze. Yet the calmness felt artificial, like the forced smile of someone hiding a dark truth. Eleanor couldn't shake the image of the figure she had seen, or thought she had seen, the night before. Every rational part of her wanted to believe it was a trick of the light or her mind playing games in the darkness. Claire, meanwhile, had grown increasingly uneasy. She refused to go near the fields and spent most of her time indoors, her usual curiosity replaced by a nervous energy. "It's like the corn is alive, Mom," she said at breakfast, pushing her cereal around the bowl without eating. "When I walk past it, I feel pulled like it wants me to go in." Eleanor dismissed her daughter's fears aloud, but inside, she felt a twinge of guilt. The land had started to affect her too. The whispers seemed to follow her now, faint and intermittent, but always present. She began to notice small things out of place. The sound of footsteps on the porch at night, the faint scent of burnt corn in the air. That afternoon, as Eleanor worked in the barn sorting through old equipment left by the previous owner, she was startled by a knock at the door. Standing there was a man she had never seen before. He was tall and wiry, his face weathered like old leather. His clothes were simple, yet something about him felt off. He introduced himself as Amos, a former farmhand who had worked the fields years ago. "I heard you'd bought the place," he said, his voice raspy and low. "Thought I'd come by, see if you needed help." Eleanor hesitated. There was an edge to Amos, an unsettling calmness in the way he spoke, as if he knew more than he let on. Still, the prospect of having someone familiar with the land was appealing, especially given the strange events she'd been experiencing. She accepted his offer, though she couldn't shake the feeling that Amos was watching her too closely, studying her reactions with quiet intensity. As the days passed, Amos proved to be both knowledgeable and unervingly enigmatic. He worked with a precision that bordered on mechanical, rarely speaking unless directly addressed. When Eleanor asked about the land's peculiarities, he shrugged. "The fields have their ways," he said cryptically. "Best to respect them, not question too much." One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Amos approached Eleanor with an unusual request. "There's a part of the fields you shouldn't go near," he said, his tone unusually stern. "The western edge by the old scarecrow. It's not safe." Eleanor's curiosity flared. Why had he singled out that area? The fields were massive, and she had only explored a fraction of them. But something in Amos's eyes, a flicker of fear perhaps, made her nod in agreement. She didn't press him for details, though the unease in her stomach grew heavier. That night, Eleanor awoke to the sound of faint scratching against her bedroom window. Heart pounding, she peered outside. The fields stretched out in the moonlight, their stalks casting long shadows. At first, she saw nothing. Then a movement caught her eye. Near the western edge, a dark shape was weaving through the corn, moving with an unnatural fluidity. She couldn't make out its form, but it wasn't Amos, nor was it anything she could identify. It paused briefly, as if aware of her gaze, then disappeared into the rows. Eleanor backed away from the window, her pulse racing. Whatever was in the fields, it wasn't waiting for an invitation. Eleanor found herself glancing at the fields more often than she cared to admit. By day, they exuded an almost hypnotic beauty, their rows precise and endless under the sun. But as dusk fell, their charm dissolved, replaced by a creeping unease. The corn, once golden and alive, seemed to darken, its stalks leaning toward her as if listening, waiting. That evening, she decided to walk the perimeter of the fields, hoping to calm her nerves and reclaim a sense of control over her land. Armed with a flashlight and accompanied by Claire, who begrudgingly agreed to join her, Eleanor reassured herself that there was nothing to fear. "It's just a walk," she said, more for her own benefit than Claire's. "We'll prove to ourselves there's nothing out there." The first leg of their walk was uneventful. The light from the farmhouse grew dimmer as they moved further from the safety of home, but the corn remained still, swaying gently in the breeze. Claire, however, seemed on edge, her eyes darting nervously toward the stalks. "Do you hear that?" she whispered after they had covered half the distance. Eleanor stopped, straining to listen. At first, she heard nothing but the usual rustling of the corn. But then it came a faint, rhythmic tapping. It was distant but deliberate, like knuckles rapping against wood. "Probably a loose board on the barn," Eleanor said, though she wasn't convinced herself. As they continued, the sound grew louder, morphing into something more metallic. Claire clutched her mother's arm. "It's coming from the fields," she whispered. Eleanor shone her flashlight toward the rows, illuminating the dense tangle of leaves and stalks. The beam sliced through the darkness, but revealed nothing unusual. Yet the tapping persisted, now accompanied by a faint shuffling sound, as if something were moving just out of sight. "Hello," Eleanor called, her voice trembling despite her attempt to sound assertive. The fields answered with silence. Claire tugged on her arm. "We should go back, Mom. Please." Eleanor hesitated. Part of her wanted to retreat to the safety of the farmhouse, but another part, a growing, stubborn curiosity, compelled her to take another step. She stepped closer to the edge of the corn, shining her flashlight deeper into the rows. And then she saw it. A hand, small, pale, and covered in dirt, emerged briefly from the stalks before disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. Eleanor stumbled backward, nearly dropping her flashlight. Claire screamed, the sound piercing the heavy night air. Grabbing Claire's hand, Eleanor turned and ran. They didn't stop until they reached the farmhouse, slamming the door shut behind them. Both were panting, their faces pale and their hands trembling. Eleanor locked the door and pulled Claire into a tight embrace, whispering reassurances she didn't believe. Her mind raced as she replayed the moment in the corn. Whose hand was it? And why had it been there? As the tapping resumed outside, this time against the walls of the farmhouse, Eleanor realized that whatever was in the fields wasn't confined to them. It was coming closer. The morning after the night's unsettling encounter, Eleanor stood by the kitchen sink, staring out at the fields. A fog had settled over them, shrouding the stalks in a ghostly veil. The air felt heavier than usual, almost suffocating. She hadn't slept. Neither had Claire, who now sat silently at the table, clutching a mug of cocoa, her eyes sunken and rimmed with exhaustion. Eleanor had spent the night pacing the house, checking locks, peering out windows, and listening for the tapping. It had stopped shortly after dawn, but the unease lingered like a shadow. She couldn't shake the image of the hand reaching from the corn, its thin fingers curling as if beckoning her closer. By mid-morning, Amos arrived, his truck rumbling up the gravel drive. Eleanor greeted him on the porch, her expression grim. "Something's not right," she began, her voice strained. Amos listened as she recounted the events of the previous night. His face remained impassive, but his eyes darkened. When she finished, he exhaled deeply, leaning against the railing. "You went near the western edge, didn't you?" Eleanor hesitated, then nodded. "That's why I told you to stay away," Amos said, his tone sharper than usual. "There are things in these fields you don't understand, things that don't like to be disturbed." "What things?" Eleanor pressed, frustration bubbling to the surface. "You keep talking in riddles, Amos. If there's something dangerous out there, I have a right to know." Amos's gaze drifted to the horizon, where the fog still clung to the land. After a long pause, he spoke. "The scarecrow marks the boundary," he said. "Always has. Past it, the land belongs to something else." Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine. "What does that mean? Belongs to what?" "Call it what you want, spirits, shadows, the past itself," Amos replied. "This place has a history, one that runs deeper than any deed or title. People have disappeared out there, families left without a trace. The scarecrow keeps them at bay, but only if you respect the boundaries." Eleanor stared at him, torn between disbelief and a growing sense that he wasn't lying. "And if we don't?" Amos's jaw tightened. "Then they come closer. They'll test you, tempt you, until they find a way in." The words hung in the air like a dark omen. Determined to confront her fears, Eleanor decided to investigate the scarecrow. She needed to see it for herself, to understand the strange hold it seemed to have over the land. Claire begged her not to go, her voice trembling with fear, but Eleanor reassured her it would be fine. She approached the western edge, with Amos reluctantly in tow. The scarecrow loomed in the distance, its figure barely visible through the mist. As they drew closer, Eleanor noticed its strange construction. Its head was made of an old burlap sack, its body a patchwork of faded fabric and dried corn husks. But what caught her attention were the symbols carved into the wooden post it was mounted on. Intricate, looping patterns that seemed to twist and writhe the longer she looked at them. Amos stood back, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "Don't touch it," he warned. Ignoring him, Eleanor reached out, her fingers brushing the rough fabric of the scarecrow's sleeve. The air around her seemed to hum, a low vibration that rattled her bones. For a moment, everything went silent. The wind, the birds, even her own breathing. Then, the ground beneath her feet shifted. Eleanor staggered, clutching the post for support. The corn around her began to sway violently, though there was no breeze. From deep within the fields came a guttural groan, a sound that seemed to rise from the earth itself. "Eleanor!" Amos shouted, grabbing her arm and pulling her back. "We need to leave. Now!" As they hurried away, Eleanor glanced over her shoulder. The scarecrow's head had turned, its blank burlap face now staring directly at her. The whispers returned that night, louder and more insistent. But this time, they weren't confined to the fields. They echoed inside the house, circling her bed like invisible predators. Eleanor realized with dawning horror that Amos had been right. By touching the scarecrow, she had broken the boundary. And whatever was out, there was no longer waiting. The day after Eleanor's encounter with the scarecrow, the tension in the farmhouse was palpable. Claire refused to leave her room, her curtains drawn tight against the world outside. Eleanor, racked with guilt and unease, spent the morning pacing the kitchen, Amos's warnings echoing in her mind. The scarecrow, the whispers, the shifting ground, it all defied logic, yet she couldn't deny what she had seen and felt. Amos returned late that afternoon, his demeanor grimmer than before. "You've stirred them," he said without preamble. "They're awake now, and they're not going back to sleep easily." Eleanor bristled at his tone, but couldn't shake the growing dread in her chest. "Who are they, Amos? What do they want?" "They're the remnants," he replied, "of what came before settlers, before farms. This land wasn't always fields and pastures. It was sacred to those who knew how to live with it. Then came people who thought they could tame it. The scarecrow was a kind of truce, a barrier. But now," he trailed off, shaking his head. "That doesn't make sense," Eleanor snapped, more out of fear than disbelief. "Why would touching the scarecrow change anything?" Amos gave her a long, measured look. "Because it isn't just a scarecrow. It's a guardian, or a jailer, depending on how you look at it. And by touching it, you've weakened its hold." Before Eleanor could respond, a loud crash from upstairs made them both jump. Claire screamed, and Eleanor bolted up the stairs, Amos close behind her. They found Claire standing in the middle of her room, pale and trembling. Her desk chair lay overturned, and her mirror was shattered, shards of glass littering the floor. It moved," she stammered, pointing at the broken mirror. "What moved?" Eleanor demanded, her heart pounding. "The reflection," Claire whispered. "It wasn't mine. It looked like me, but it wasn't. It smiled at me, Mom." And then the glass just exploded. Amos muttered a curse under his breath, scanning the room as if expecting something to lunge from the shadows. "It's starting," he said grimly. "They're testing you?" That night, the whispers grew louder, their words more distinct. Eleanor sat in the living room, clutching a flashlight and a kitchen knife, though she knew neither would be of any use. Claire sat beside her, her knees pulled to her chest, her eyes wide with fear. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere, the walls, the floor, the very air around them. Words in a language Eleanor didn't understand, mixed with guttural growls and chilling laughter. The temperature dropped, and a foul smell, like rotting vegetation, filled the house. Amos stayed silent, standing by the window and peering into the fields. "They're trying to scare you into leaving," he said finally. "But they won't stop there. If you stay, they'll escalate. What do we do?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Amos turned to face her, his expression grave. We need to reinforce the boundary. The scarecrow has to be restored, and you need to make amends. Amends? To what? Eleanor's frustration and fear boiled over. I don't even know what I'm dealing with. Amos didn't answer. Instead, he pulled a small pouch from his jacket and handed it to her. Burn this at the base of the scarecrow tonight. It's the only chance you've got to calm them down, at least for a while. Eleanor stared at the pouch, the earthy scent of its contents filling her nostrils. And if it doesn't work, then you'll find out just how far they're willing to go, Amos said. That night, under a moonless sky, Eleanor and Amos ventured back to the scarecrow, the fields eerily silent around them. Claire stayed behind, too terrified to step outside. As Eleanor knelt at the scarecrow's base, ready to light the pouch's contents, she felt the ground tremble beneath her knees. The whispers returned, louder than ever, accompanied by a deep, resonant groan that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Eleanor struck the match, her hands shaking, and dropped it into the pouch. Flames erupted, casting flickering shadows across the scarecrow's face. For a moment, the groaning stopped, and the air grew still. But as Eleanor looked up, she saw the scarecrow's head turn toward her, its empty burlap face now seeming to smile. The fields roared to life, and Eleanor realized with chilling certainty, the scarecrow wasn't just a guardian. It was a warning, and she had just awakened something far worse. The morning after the ritual at the scarecrow was marked by an oppressive stillness. The fields, normally alive with the rustling of stalks and the hum of insects, seemed to hold their breath. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at her coffee, its warmth doing little to ease the chill in her bones. Claire sat across from her, silent, her eyes shadowed with sleeplessness. Amos arrived just after sunrise, his face set in grim determination. Did it work? Eleanor asked, though she already knew the answer. The field's unnatural silence was answer enough. Not completely, Amos admitted, his voice low, but it slowed them down. They're watching now, waiting to see what you'll do next. The words filled Eleanor with dread. Watching. The very idea made her skin crawl. She glanced at Claire, who looked smaller than ever, huddled in her oversized sweater. We can't stay here, Eleanor said suddenly, her voice trembling. We need to leave, Amos. Amos shook his head. You leave now, and they'll follow you. Whatever this is, it's tied to you. Running won't help. Claire whimpered softly, and Eleanor reached across the table to squeeze her hand. Then what do we do? Just wait for them to come for us? No, Amos said. We dig deeper. If we're going to put this to rest, we need to understand what we're dealing with. The fields have a history, Eleanor. It's time you learned it. Amos led them to the old barn on the property, its weathered wood groaning under the weight of years. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of hay and decay. In the far corner, beneath a tattered tarp, Amos revealed an old trunk, its iron hinges rusted but still functional. This belonged to the Connors, Amos explained, referencing the family who had owned the farm before Eleanor. They were the last ones to deal with this. Eleanor helped Amos lift the heavy lid, revealing a collection of yellowed papers, faded photographs, and strange trinkets. A bundle of feathers tied with twine, a jar of dried herbs, a small wooden carving of a figure that resembled the scarecrow. Among the items was a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked with age. Eleanor opened the journal, the brittle pages crackling under her fingers. The entries, written in a spidery hand, chronicled the Connors' time on the farm. At first, the entries were mundane, notes about crop yields, weather patterns, and family life. But as she flipped further, the tone shifted. The later entries were filled with warnings about the fields, references to the Watchers and the boundary. One entry, dated October 13th, 1921, caught her attention. The whispers have returned. We tried the offering, but it was not enough. They grow restless, and the scarecrow's power weakens. Last night, Thomas swore he saw a figure standing at the edge of the fields, its eyes glowing in the dark. We must strengthen the boundary before it's too late. Eleanor's heart raced as she read on. The entries described rituals similar to the one Amos had performed, but with additional steps, markings on the ground, chants in a forgotten language, and sacrifices. What kind of sacrifices? Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Amos hesitated. Animals mostly, he said, but there are mentions of other things. Eleanor's stomach churned. You mean people? Amos didn't answer, but the look in his eyes was enough. That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. The journal's words haunted her, their implications too terrible to ignore. She sat by the window, staring out at the fields. The scarecrow stood where they had left it, its burlap face glowing faintly in the moonlight. As the hours dragged on, the whispers began again, louder and more insistent than before. This time, they were accompanied by shadows moving among the stalks, their shapes too tall, too thin to be human. Eleanor felt a wave of despair wash over her. The Connors had tried and failed to contain whatever haunted this land. What hope did she and Claire have? But as she watched the shadows writhe and twist, a spark of defiance ignited within her. She wouldn't let the fields consume her family. If the scarecrow was a guardian, then she would find a way to restore its power, no matter the cost. Eleanor turned back to the journal, determined to uncover the truth. Whatever the Connors had started, she would finish. The fields had chosen her, but they would regret it. Morning broke over the farm with a muted, gray light, the sun hidden behind a veil of low-hanging clouds. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table, bleary-eyed and clutching the Connor family journal like a lifeline. Claire was upstairs, refusing to come down after another night filled with restless whispers and ominous shadows at her window. Amos had left before dawn, promising to gather supplies for the next ritual, but his parting words still echoed in Eleanor's mind. Stay out of the fields. The journal lay open before her, its aged pages filled with cryptic instructions and ominous warnings. Eleanor traced a finger over the spidery handwriting, pausing at a passage that described the Watchers as both custodians and punishers, entities that thrived on the boundary between life and death. The scarecrow, it seemed, was a ward, a tether holding their power at bay. But the journal was frustratingly vague about how to restore the scarecrow's strength. Symbols were described, but not drawn. Chants were referenced, but never transcribed. It was as though the Connors had deliberately left pieces of the puzzle missing, perhaps fearing that the wrong hands might misuse the knowledge. A noise from outside shattered Eleanor's focus, a faint rustling, like footsteps brushing against the stalks. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. Slowly, she rose and moved to the window, peering out at the fields. The stalks stood unnaturally still despite the light breeze. But there, at the edge of the corn, a figure stood. It was tall and emaciated, its elongated limbs bending at unnatural angles. Its face, or what passed for one, was obscured by the shadows of the stalks, but Eleanor could feel its gaze boring into her. She stumbled back from the window, her breath hitching. The figure didn't follow, didn't move, but its presence lingered, oppressive and menacing. Gathering her courage, Eleanor stepped outside, clutching the flashlight Amos had left behind. The fields were unnervingly quiet, the air thick with an earthy, damp smell. She kept to the edge of the stalks, scanning for any sign of movement. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. The figure didn't respond, but the corn swayed as though something unseen moved within it. The whispers started again, faint at first but growing louder. They weren't coming from the stalks this time. They seemed to emanate from the ground itself, rising up through the soil. Eleanor's flashlight flickered, and for a moment, the beam illuminated the figure. It wasn't human. Its limbs were too long, its torso impossibly thin, its head tilted unnaturally as though studying her. Then, with a guttural sound that seemed to vibrate in her bones, it melted back into the corn. Eleanor stumbled back into the house, slamming the door behind her. She pressed her back against the wood, her breaths coming in short gasps. The whispers faded, but the sense of being watched remained. Claire came downstairs, her face pale. "Mom, what's happening?" Eleanor hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. It's Just the fields, she said weakly. Claire's eyes filled with tears. You saw it, didn't you? The thing in the corn? Eleanor nodded, unable to lie. We'll figure this out, she promised, though she didn't believe her own words. That night, Eleanor returned to the journal, desperate for answers. She pored over the entries, looking for anything she might have missed. One passage caught her eye, describing a night of the new moon when the Watchers were at their most vulnerable. It spoke of a ritual involving blood, animal blood specifically, but warned of dire consequences if performed incorrectly. Eleanor's stomach churned. She wasn't sure she had the strength for what lay ahead, but the Watchers were growing bolder, and time was running out. If she didn't act soon, the fields would claim them all. She closed the journal and glanced out the window. The scarecrow loomed in the distance, its burlap face unreadable in the dark. Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching her too, waiting for her next move. The next morning, Eleanor awoke to the sound of Claire crying. She bolted upright, her heart racing, and found her daughter in the living room, staring at a pile of dead crows on the porch. Their black feathers glistened with dew, their lifeless bodies arranged in a perfect circle. At the center of the circle was a single ear of corn, its husk peeled back to reveal kernels of an unnatural, pale gray color. What does it mean? Claire whispered, clutching Eleanor's arm. It's a warning, Eleanor replied, though she wasn't sure. The grotesque display felt deliberate, a message from the Watchers, or whoever, or whatever, was haunting the fields. Amos arrived an hour later, carrying a burlap sack filled with jars of herbs, chalk, and an assortment of tools Eleanor didn't recognize. His face darkened when he saw the scene on the porch. They're growing impatient, he said. They know we're trying to stop them. Eleanor showed him the passage in the journal about the ritual during the new moon. Amos read it in silence, his expression grim. This is dangerous, he said. If we do it wrong, we might make things worse. Claire, who had been silently listening, spoke up. What happens if we do nothing? Amos hesitated before answering. They'll take what they want. You, the farm. Maybe worse. Eleanor felt a surge of determination. She couldn't let the Watchers win. Not after everything they'd already endured. We'll do it, she said firmly. We'll perform the ritual. Preparations began that afternoon. Amos drew intricate symbols around the scarecrow using the chalk and herbs, creating a boundary that he said would amplify its protective power. Eleanor fetched a knife and an old jar from the kitchen, her hands trembling as she thought about what they would need to do. The hardest part was convincing Claire to stay in the house. You can't be out there, Eleanor told her. It's not safe. But it's not safe in here either, Claire argued, her voice quivering. I can hear them at night. I see them in the shadows. Eleanor hugged her daughter tightly. I promise I'll do everything I can to protect you. But I need you to trust me. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the fields took on an eerie glow. The scarecrow stood at the center of the ritual site, its burlap face painted with symbols that Amos claimed would strengthen its bond to the land. Eleanor and Amos worked in tense silence, their movements deliberate and precise. When the moon rose, a thin, silver sliver against the black sky, they began. Amos chanted in a language Eleanor didn't recognize, his voice low and melodic. Eleanor cut her palm with a knife, wincing as blood pooled in her hand. She let the blood drip onto the ground around the scarecrow, following the instructions in the journal. The air grew heavy, charged with an unseen energy. The whispers started again, louder this time, surrounding them on all sides. Eleanor glanced toward the house and saw Claire watching from the window, her face pale and frightened. The ground beneath the scarecrow began to tremble, and for a moment, Eleanor thought the ritual was working. But then the whispers turned into screams, high-pitched, inhuman shrieks that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Amos stopped chanting, his eyes wide with terror. Something's wrong, he said. The scarecrow's head tilted, its burlap face twisting as though it were alive. The symbols Amos had painted on it began to glow, but instead of a protective light, they emitted a sickly green hue. The boundary around the scarecrow shattered like glass, and the figures from the fields emerged, their lanky bodies gliding through the stalks. Eleanor's heart sank as she realized their mistake. The ritual hadn't strengthened the Scarecrow's power. It had weakened it, breaking the fragile barrier that had kept the Watchers at bay. "Run!" Amos shouted, grabbing Eleanor's arm. They sprinted toward the house, the Watchers close behind. Their movements were unnatural, jerky, as though they were marionettes controlled by an unseen force. Eleanor and Amos barely made it inside before slamming the door shut. Claire rushed to them, her eyes wide with fear. "What happened?" she asked. "We've made them angry," Amos said, his voice trembling. "And now, they won't stop until they've taken what they want." Eleanor looked out the window. The Watchers were standing at the edge of the fields, their glowing eyes fixed on the house. For the first time, she realized the truth. The fields weren't just haunted. They were alive, and they were hungry. The house had become a fortress overnight. Amos nailed boards across the windows while Eleanor and Claire pushed furniture against the doors. The Watchers moved closer as the night deepened, their silhouettes stark against the pale glow of the moon. They were no longer content to linger at the edge of the fields. By midnight, they stood just beyond the porch, unmoving but palpably menacing. Inside, Eleanor flipped through the journal with trembling hands, searching for any clue, any solution they might have missed. Amos sat at the table, sharpening a long hunting knife he'd brought from his truck. Claire huddled in the corner, her knees drawn to her chest. "They're testing us," Amos muttered, his voice breaking the oppressive silence. "Waiting for us to panic. They're more than just Watchers," Eleanor replied. She pointed to a passage in the journal. "The Connors called them takers. They don't just haunt the fields. They consume everything they touch." The words hung heavy in the air. Outside, the Watchers began to move. Their steps were slow, deliberate, and unnatural, as if their spindly legs were learning how to walk. One by one, they ascended the porch, their hollow eyes fixed on the house. The first knock came suddenly, a sharp, deliberate rap against the door. It wasn't frantic or aggressive. It was patient, almost polite. Eleanor froze, clutching the journal to her chest. Another knock followed, this time on the kitchen window. Then another, on the back door. "They're surrounding us," Claire whispered, her voice trembling. Amos stood, gripping the knife tightly. "They can't come in unless we let them," he said. "How do you know that?" Eleanor asked. "I don't," Amos admitted. The knocking intensified, now accompanied by a low, guttural sound that vibrated through the walls. Eleanor's mind raced. The journal spoke of the Scarecrow as a ward, but it was no longer a reliable shield. The ritual had failed, and the Watchers had grown bolder. "What if we use fire?" Claire asked suddenly, breaking the tense silence. Eleanor and Amos exchanged a glance. Fire was risky. The house was old, surrounded by dry corn stalks, and any blaze could spiral out of control. But it might be their only chance to drive the Watchers back. "We need to burn the Scarecrow," Eleanor said, her voice firm despite her fear. Amos shook his head. "If we burn it without a proper ritual, we might make things worse." "Worse than this?" Eleanor gestured to the Watchers, who were now clawing at the windows with elongated fingers. Amos hesitated, then nodded. "Fine, we'll try." They worked quickly, gathering what supplies they could. Amos doused a rag in gasoline from a spare can in his truck, wrapping it around a makeshift torch. Claire stayed behind, barricaded in the living room, while Eleanor and Amos crept outside. The Watchers didn't pursue them immediately. Instead, they watched, their heads cocked at unnatural angles. Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that they were amused, as if this was all part of their game. When they reached the Scarecrow, Eleanor hesitated. Its burlap face was twisted into a grotesque grin, the glowing symbols now faded. She could still feel the residual energy from the failed ritual, a pulsing, malevolent force. "Do it," Amos urged, holding the torch. Eleanor struck the match, her hands shaking. As the flame caught, the Watchers let out a collective shriek that pierced the night. They surged forward, their bodies twisting and contorting as they moved. Amos threw the torch, and the Scarecrow erupted in flames. The fire spread quickly, consuming the dry straw and wooden frame. The Watchers recoiled, their forms flickering like mirages. For a moment, Eleanor thought it was working. But then the ground beneath the scarecrow began to tremble. The fire flared, burning brighter and hotter than it should have, and the watchers stopped retreating. Instead, they began to laugh, a deep, resonant sound that echoed through the fields. Eleanor realized too late what had happened. The fire hadn't destroyed the scarecrow. It had released something far worse. A crack split the earth where the scarecrow had stood, and a shadowy figure began to rise. Taller and darker than the watchers, its presence radiated a suffocating dread. The watchers knelt before it, their hollow eyes now glowing with reverence. Amos grabbed Eleanor's arm, pulling her back toward the house. "Run," he shouted. They sprinted across the yard, the ground shaking beneath their feet. The shadowy figure didn't pursue them. It didn't need to. Its power was palpable, a storm gathering on the horizon. As they reached the house, Eleanor looked back and saw the watchers converging, their forms blending into the shadow. They had unleashed something ancient, something that had been waiting for centuries beneath the fields. And now it was awake. The night felt suffocating. The air was thick with the stench of burning straw, mingling with the acrid smell of fear that clung to Eleanor and Amos. Inside the house, the atmosphere was tense, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for the inevitable. The watchers had not followed them inside, but the shadowy figure, the one they had unwittingly released, was still there, somewhere, lurking at the edges of their perception. Eleanor could feel it in her bones, that malevolent presence. It was as if the land itself had shifted, and the fields were no longer simply land. They were something else entirely. The harvest was approaching, but it was no longer a time of bounty. The earth itself was hungry. "We've made a terrible mistake," Amos muttered, his voice strained. He paced the living room, the blade of his hunting knife gleaming in the dim light. He didn't meet Eleanor's gaze. Eleanor tried to steady her breath, her mind reeling. The ritual had been a desperate attempt to control the power in the fields, to keep the watchers at bay. But they had miscalculated. They had done the opposite. By setting the scarecrow aflame, they had awakened something far older, something far more dangerous. "What do we do now?" she asked, though she was not sure if she wanted an answer. Amos stopped pacing, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "We need to destroy the source. The shadow, the figure, it's what controls the watchers. It's tied to the land, to the corn itself. If we don't stop it, it will spread, and it will consume everything." Eleanor clenched her fists. "Then we go to the fields. We end this?" Amos shook his head slowly. "No, you don't understand. It's not as simple as burning the scarecrow. This thing, whatever it is, it's rooted in the land. The soil, the crops, they're all connected to it. If we disturb it too much, we risk triggering a harvest. The harvest. The land will claim its due, and no one will be spared." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of inevitability. The harvest was not a metaphor. It was not a simple fall crop that one could reap and store away for winter. It was something far darker, something that only those who lived on the land understood. It was the time when the earth demanded payment in blood and lives. "Amos," Eleanor said, her voice cold. "What are we dealing with here? What is this harvest?" He sighed, his eyes distant. "It's an ancient cycle. The fields have always been a place of power. When the time is right, when the harvest approaches, the land calls. It doesn't matter who or what you are. It doesn't matter if you've been here for generations or if you've just arrived. The land demands its price, and it claims what is owed." Eleanor felt a chill creep up her spine. "But why now? Why us?" "The watchers have always been there," Amos explained. "They're the guardians, the ones who ensure the harvest happens. They're not here to harm us, not directly. But the shadow, the one that's risen, it's the one that makes the call. It brings the harvest, and it's been sleeping for centuries. We woke it." Claire had remained silent during the exchange, but now she spoke, her voice trembling. "What happens during the harvest?" Eleanor turned to her daughter, seeing the fear in her eyes. Amos didn't respond immediately, his face drawn with the weight of what he knew. When he spoke, his voice was low, almost a whisper. "People vanish. They disappear, taken by the land itself. Sometimes they return, twisted, no longer human. Other times, they're never seen again. It's the price the earth demands, and it doesn't care who pays it. Eleanor's blood ran cold. The harvest wasn't just about crops. It was about souls. It was a ritual of death, a sacrifice, and they had unknowingly set it in motion. Amos continued, "We have one chance to stop it. There's a ritual, an old one, passed down by the Connors and others who lived here before. It requires blood, but not just any blood. It has to be the blood of the land, the one thing the shadow craves the most. It has to be the corn itself." Eleanor blinked, confused. "The corn?" Amos nodded grimly. "Yes, it's the lifeblood of the harvest. The shadow, the watchers, the land, it all feeds on it. To end this, to stop the harvest before it consumes everything, we need to destroy the very source." Claire looked between the two of them, her face pale. "How do we do that?" Eleanor felt a cold resolve settle over her. "We have to burn it. We burn the fields. We destroy the corn, the land, the watchers. It's the only way." Amos hesitated. "It might not work. We might end up feeding it more than we destroy. But if we don't try, we'll lose everything," Eleanor replied. There was no time to waste. The harvest was coming, and Eleanor knew that they had no choice but to confront the darkness that had taken root in the fields. But as they prepared to face it, she couldn't shake the feeling that the land had already claimed them. The watchers, the shadow, they were only the beginning. What lay beneath the soil was far more terrifying, and it was hungry. The decision was made, but the weight of it pressed heavily on Eleanor's chest. The air outside had turned bitterly cold, a stark contrast to the sweltering heat of the previous days. The wind had shifted, now carrying with it an unsettling stillness, as if nature itself had quieted in anticipation of the impending harvest. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison, its walls closing in around them with every passing moment. Eleanor stood by the window, watching the fields. The rows of corn seemed to stretch on forever, their yellowing husks now twisted and knotted, as though something had taken root deep within the soil. Amos and Claire had gathered what they could, preparing for their journey into the heart of the fields. "We leave at dawn," Amos said, his voice grim. He had packed a small bag with supplies, matches, a few bottles of water, and a weathered map of the area that he claimed would guide them to the ritual site. Eleanor nodded, but her mind raced. She had no idea what they would encounter out there. The land had already shown its power, had already made its demands. What else awaited them in the heart of the fields? "Mom," Claire's voice broke through her thoughts. "Are we really going to burn it all? Everything?" Eleanor turned to face her daughter. Claire's eyes were wide with fear, her hand clutching a small wooden token, a piece of the scarecrow she had taken before they had burned it. Eleanor had noticed it earlier, but hadn't said anything. It was a token of the land's curse, something meant to bind Claire to it. "We have to, Claire," Eleanor said softly. "It's the only way. If we don't, the harvest will come, and it won't be just us it takes." Claire nodded, though her lips trembled. She didn't fully understand, not yet. But Eleanor could see the resolve in her daughter's eyes. She knew that Claire, in her own way, understood the stakes. The night passed in agonizing silence. The wind continued to howl outside, rattling the windows as if the earth itself were angry at their decision. But they couldn't delay any longer. At first light, they left the house and made their way toward the fields. The land seemed to stretch out before them, vast and empty, yet filled with a malevolent presence. The rows of corn seemed to lean in toward them, as though watching, waiting. Eleanor could feel the ground beneath her feet vibrating, a low hum that seemed to come from the very core of the earth. "There's something down there," she muttered, more to herself than to Amos, who was walking beside her. Amos didn't answer, but his expression was grim. He too could feel it, the power that had begun to awaken, the same energy that had turned the soil black and the corn twisted. They reached the center of the fields by mid-morning. It was there, in the very heart of the corn, that the ritual site had once stood. The ground was marked with strange symbols, faded now with time, but still visible to the keen eye. Amos knelt down, brushing away the dirt with his hands to uncover the old stone altar. "This is it," he said, his voice tinged with reverence. Eleanor looked at the altar, a simple stone slab that had been carved with runes she couldn't understand. The air around it felt heavy, thick with a power that pulsed in time with her own heartbeat. She could feel the land beneath her feet, alive and aware, and she knew that they were treading on dangerous ground. "What do we do now?" Claire asked, her voice small. Amos stood up and surveyed the altar. "We need to perform the ritual. The land will accept the sacrifice, but only if it's done correctly. We offer the blood of the land, the corn, and then we burn it all. We have to make sure that the harvest doesn't claim anyone else." Eleanor's stomach twisted at the thought. The land would take what it needed, whether they offered it willingly or not. The harvest was inevitable, but they had no choice. If they didn't make the sacrifice, it would come for them all. Amos began to arrange the corn around the altar, placing it in a circle. He then pulled out a knife, the same one he had carried since they arrived. "This is the blood," he said, his voice steady. "The land will demand it. We give it willingly." Eleanor watched as Amos cut into the corn, the sap running dark and thick from the stalks. She could feel the earth's hunger, a gnawing, insistent pull that seemed to reverberate through her very bones. Claire stepped forward, holding the wooden token from the scarecrow. It was glowing faintly now, pulsing with an eerie light. She placed it carefully on the altar. "This is for you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. For a moment, nothing happened. The wind shifted, and the earth seemed to breathe in time with the ritual. Then, the ground began to tremble, and the sky darkened. The corn around them began to sway, even though there was no breeze. The earth itself seemed to wake, to come alive. Amos stood tall, his hands raised to the sky. "We offer this to you, land. We offer the blood of the corn. We offer the sacrifice. Let the harvest end." The ground beneath them shifted again, and Eleanor felt a coldness seep into her very soul. The earth had accepted their offering, but it was not satisfied. The harvest was not over. It was only just beginning. The world around them was in chaos. The ritual had failed, though they had followed Amos' instructions to the letter. The land had taken their offerings, yes, but something had gone wrong. The air was thick with the smell of burning corn and something darker, more pungent, as though the earth itself had decided it wasn't enough. The harvest had not ended. It had only been stirred. The ground beneath their feet felt alive, shifting with a restless hunger. Eleanor stood frozen, staring at the altar, her mind racing. She had hoped that the ritual would work. She had clung to the belief that they could undo what had been set in motion years ago, that the land's power could be appeased with enough sacrifice. But this wasn't the end. It was a new beginning, and she wasn't sure if they were prepared for what was to come. Amos was panting, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. "It's not over," he said, almost to himself. "We thought we could control it, but we've only awakened it more fully. We've invited it back." Eleanor turned toward him, her voice tight with urgency. "What do you mean? What did we do wrong?" He shook his head. "It's not about what we did. The land wasn't just dormant. It was waiting. It's been waiting for the right moment, and now that it has the blood, the harvest, it's ready to take everything." Claire, standing off to the side, stared into the distance, her hands gripping her small wooden token tightly. Her eyes were filled with a quiet terror, one that sent a shiver up Eleanor's spine. "What does it want?" Claire whispered. Eleanor wasn't sure. She had been so certain that burning the corn, making the sacrifice, would restore balance. She had thought they could escape the land's wrath, but now she feared they might be too late. The world felt darker, the shadows stretching further as the corn rustled around them, alive and aware. Amos took a step toward the edge of the field, his eyes scanning the horizon. "The harvest isn't just about the corn," he muttered. "It's about the land, the very earth itself. It's the land's way of making sure it's fed. And we fed it too much." Eleanor's stomach churned. She felt as though she were standing on the edge of something vast, something ancient. The land had never truly been dormant. It had always been there, watching, waiting for the right moment to claim its due. And now, that moment had arrived. The earth seemed to thrum beneath their feet. Eleanor could hear it, low, reverberating, a hum that vibrated in her bones. It wasn't the wind. It was something else. Something older, more primal. And it was coming from deep within the ground. "Amos," Eleanor said, her voice trembling. "What do we do now?" Amos didn't answer right away. He was still scanning the field, his hand gripping his knife tightly. The symbol on the altar was glowing faintly, pulsing with a dark energy. Eleanor could feel it, too, an oppressive, suffocating presence. The land was alive, but it wasn't the same land that had nurtured them all these years. It had changed. It had become something else entirely. Then the wind shifted. It howled louder, the earth trembling beneath them as if it were being stirred from its slumber. Eleanor turned toward the fields, her breath catching in her throat. The corn was moving, not just swaying, but shifting, rippling, as though something was crawling through it. She could see the shapes now, moving beneath the surface of the rows, twisting and rearing up like serpents. The corn was alive, and it was reaching for them. "What the hell is that?" Claire gasped, stepping back. Amos didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the movement in the field, his face pale. "The harvest is coming," he said hoarsely. "We've stirred it. It's alive, and it's hungry, and it won't stop until it's fed." Eleanor's heart raced. The land, the earth itself, was calling to them, and it was clear that their offering had only made it worse. They hadn't just awakened something. They had invited it to feast. And now, as the corn moved, undulating in a grotesque dance, she knew that the land was claiming what was rightfully its. And they were the next part of the harvest. "We need to leave," Eleanor said urgently, grabbing Claire's arm. "Now!" But Amos didn't move. Instead, he stepped forward, his voice barely audible over the growing roar of the wind. "It's already too late." Eleanor's blood ran cold as she watched him. There was a deep sadness in his eyes, a resignation she hadn't seen before. He knew something they didn't. "We're not just dealing with the land anymore," he said, his voice shaking. "The earth has been feeding off the souls of those who came before us. It's not just a curse, it's a pact, and it's been waiting for us to fulfill our part of it. The blood, the sacrifice, it's what keeps the harvest alive. We're bound to it, just as the land is bound to us." Eleanor felt the ground tremble again, and this time, it wasn't just beneath her feet. The air was thick, suffocating, as if the very atmosphere was charged with dark energy. The wind howled louder, the corn began to shake violently, and the earth began to crack open beneath them, as though it was stretching to make room for something far worse than they had imagined. And then, from the depths of the earth, a sound, a deep, guttural growl, rose up, shaking the very foundation of the land. It was a sound like no other, a call from the deep. The harvest had begun. The darkness surrounding them was almost suffocating, thick with an energy that seemed to bend the very air. Eleanor could feel the weight of the land pressing against her chest, and she had never felt so small, so vulnerable. The growl that had risen from deep within the earth was still echoing through the field, reverberating like the sound of ancient, cursed things awakening. Whatever they had stirred, whatever had been buried under the soil, was now fully awake, and it was more than just a harvest. It was a reckoning. The wind had ceased, leaving an eerie stillness behind. The corn had stopped moving, and the field was silent. But it was the silence of something vast and watching, the kind of silence you hear just before a storm. Eleanor glanced at Amos, whose face was shadowed, eyes wide with terror. She could see his lips moving, but no sound came out, as though the very air had been stolen from him. The realization was sinking in. There was no escaping what they had invited. The price had already been set. The corn, once swaying gently in the breeze, now stood rigid, its tall stalk seeming to stretch toward the heavens. In the distance, the outline of the farmhouse stood like a silhouette against the faint glow of a dimming sky. It was no longer just a farm. It was the heart of something much darker, its pulse beating in rhythm with the land itself. Eleanor could feel it deep within her bones. The harvest wasn't just a cycle of growth and decay. It was a pact, an agreement sealed long ago. A price had been paid, and now it was time for the land to collect. She tried to move, to pull Claire towards safety, but her feet were rooted to the ground, as though the earth itself was holding her in place. The air felt thick, almost viscous, and she could hear the faintest whispers in the wind, a murmur just beneath the roar of her heartbeat. The voices of those who had come before them, or was it the land itself speaking? She couldn't tell, but it was as if the very ground around them had become alive, breathing in sync with their every movement. There was no escape. Claire, shaking, clutched Eleanor's arm. "Eleanor, what do we do? What's happening to us?" Her voice was raw, trembling as though she were trying to hold on to something solid in the midst of a storm. Eleanor didn't have an answer. How could she? No matter how much she had hoped that the ritual would end the curse, the truth was now clear. They had only fed it, fueled it with their own desperation. And now they were bound to the very thing they had tried to control. Amos was still muttering to himself, his hands shaking as he gripped the knife he had once used for the ritual. "The harvest comes for all who have sown the land with blood," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "We thought we could escape it, but the land always collects. There's no end to the cycle." His words hung heavy in the air, like an ancient warning. But it wasn't just a warning, it was a promise. Eleanor turned toward him, her eyes wide. "What are you talking about? You said we could stop it." Her voice cracked, disbelief creeping in her chest like an ice-cold fist. "You lied to us?" Amos didn't look at her. His gaze was fixed on the horizon, where the farmhouse now seemed to pulse with an unnatural light, as though it were alive with the energy of the harvest. "I didn't lie," he said softly. "I just didn't understand the full price. None of us did. The land has been feeding for generations, and now we've all become part of it. We are the price, Eleanor. You, Claire, all of us. We are the offering, the final sacrifice." Claire let out a strangled sob, and Eleanor pulled her closer, her heart racing. The realization was settling over them like a thick fog. The land wasn't just a part of the cycle, it was the cycle, and they were caught in it. There was no escape now. No way to outrun the harvest that had been sown with every life that had walked across this cursed field. The ground beneath them shifted again. This time, the earth trembled violently, as if the very land was reaching upward, clawing for them. Eleanor stumbled back, almost losing her footing. She could hear the sound of something breaking, the corn stalks cracking, splitting, as though something beneath the soil was pushing upward, struggling to free itself. The field was alive, and it was coming for them. "Eleanor, what do we do?" Claire gasped, her voice tight with panic. Eleanor didn't have an answer. The truth was there was no answer. Not anymore. The land had been waiting, and it had claimed what it was owed. The pact had been made long before their arrival, long before anyone had come to tend this farm. They were simply the latest in a long line of souls who had been harvested by the earth. A deep rumbling filled the air, and for a moment, it felt as though the ground itself were about to swallow them whole. The light from the farmhouse flickered, and for a brief instant, Eleanor thought she saw something moving inside, something watching them, waiting. But before she could react, a low, guttural growl filled the air, reverberating through the soil beneath her feet. It was the harvest coming for them, and there was no turning back. The earth's rumble had ceased, but the oppressive weight in the air had not lifted. If anything, it had grown heavier, more suffocating. Eleanor stood frozen, every nerve in her body screaming to run, to escape the dreadful grip the land seemed to have on her. Yet, she knew that running wasn't an option. The harvest wasn't just a force of nature. It was a reckoning, and it had begun. The land had stirred, and it was no longer content to wait. Amos had collapsed to his knees, his hands pressed against the soil as though trying to draw power from it, or perhaps to surrender to it. His breath came in ragged gasps, and his eyes, once filled with determination, now seemed glazed over, empty. "It's too late," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the now still wind. "The pact, the price, it's already been set. There's no turning back now." Eleanor could hardly comprehend his words. The idea of a pact, of a deal made with something so ancient, so unfathomable, was beyond her understanding. How had they come to this point? How had she allowed herself to be dragged into something so far beyond her control? Her thoughts raced, but each one seemed to collide with the next, leaving her dizzy and disoriented. But then, in the midst of the chaos of her mind, one thought cut through Claire. Her friend was still clinging to her, her face pale with terror. Claire had always been the voice of reason, the one who tried to keep their feet planted on solid ground. And now, even she seemed to be losing herself to the madness of the harvest. The land was claiming them both, just as it had claimed everyone else before them. "We have to get out of here," Claire said, her voice trembling, though there was a desperation in it now. She tugged at Eleanor's arm, pulling her toward the edge of the field. "We can't stay here. We need to leave before it takes us too." Eleanor wanted to agree, wanted to believe that they could escape, but something deep inside told her that leaving wasn't an option anymore. The land had claimed them. It was bound to them, and they were bound to it. There was no running from a reckoning like this. As if to punctuate her thoughts, the ground trembled once more. This time, it wasn't just the soil shifting. It was as though something beneath the earth was stirring, pulling itself from the depths. The sound was like the cracking of bones, followed by a low, guttural growl that sent a chill down Eleanor's spine. Whatever had been buried beneath this cursed land was not just awakening. It was coming for them. The cornfield, which had been so still moments before, now seemed to writhe with life. The stalks twisted and bent, as though they were being pulled by invisible hands. Eleanor could see dark shapes moving between the rows, shadows that didn't belong to the night. It was as if the very earth had become alive, and it was feeding on their fear, their hopelessness. Eleanor's mind raced. What had Amos meant by the price? What had they really done when they performed that ritual? The land, the harvest, everything was interconnected in a way she couldn't fully grasp. But one thing was becoming painfully clear. They were not the first to pay this price, nor would they be the last. The land had been feeding, waiting for the moment when it could claim what was owed to it. Claire's grip tightened around Eleanor's arm, and the desperation in her eyes only intensified. "We can't stay here, Eleanor," she whispered. "We can't," but she didn't finish. The words were caught in her throat as the air around them seemed to change. A thick fog began to roll across the field, heavy and unnatural, creeping over the rows of corn like a living thing. Then from within the fog, a figure emerged. It was tall, unnaturally so, and its outline was vague, shifting like smoke in the distance. The figure moved with a strange grace, its limbs extending in ways that were not entirely human. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat, and she instinctively stepped back, pulling Claire along with her. The figure, however, did not seem to notice them. It was fixated on something deeper in the field, its attention drawn to a spot where the corn appeared to be particularly thick. As it moved closer to that spot, the air grew colder and the fog thickened. The figure seemed to shimmer, and Eleanor's vision blurred as though the very essence of reality was warping around her. Then, in an instant, the figure was gone, vanished as though it had never been there. But the feeling it left behind lingered, a sense of impending doom that weighed heavy in Eleanor's chest. She glanced at Amos, but he was no longer kneeling on the ground. He had stood up, his face now twisted in a grotesque mix of awe and terror. His eyes were wide, unfocused, as though he were seeing something they couldn't. "It's here," Amos whispered, his voice trembling. "It's come for us." Eleanor's pulse quickened as she turned toward Claire, whose face had gone even paler, her lips pressed tight together. "We need to leave. We need to find a way out of here now." Claire's voice was a frantic whisper, barely audible over the growing hum in the air. But Eleanor could feel it now, too. The land had claimed them. It had taken root in their souls. There would be no escape. They were part of the harvest now, and the reckoning had only just begun. As the fog receded and the night deepened, Eleanor and Claire found themselves standing at the edge of the field, frozen in place by a shared realization. They were no longer in control of their fate. The moment the figure had vanished, the heavy air had thickened, as if the very land had grown more oppressive, more aware of them. There was no longer any illusion of normalcy in the air. They weren't just dealing with the supernatural. They were facing something far older, far more relentless than anything they could comprehend. Amos had not moved. He stood in place, his eyes wide and distant, as though he were staring into a world that existed beyond their own. Eleanor could feel his presence, but it was as though he were no longer truly with them. The man who had led them to this cursed place, the one who had always been the beacon of knowledge and purpose, was now little more than a shell of the man he had been. Something had taken root within him, and it was clear that the land had claimed him just as it had claimed the others before him. The price of silence was a concept Eleanor could never have fully grasped before this night. How could silence ever hold such weight? How could it ever become so suffocating, so dangerous? But now, standing in the oppressive stillness of the field, she understood. The harvest had always been more than just a physical event. It was a transactional ritual, a pact born from the land's insatiable hunger. In their silence, they had unknowingly agreed to a price far greater than any of them could have imagined. As the seconds stretched on, the rustling of the corn, once gentle, now seemed deliberate, almost mocking in its rhythm. The wind had died completely, and in its place, there was only the faintest sound of something stirring just beyond the corn's borders. It was as though the land itself was watching them, waiting for their next move, but with no intention of allowing them to escape. "I don't understand." Claire's voice broke the silence, hoarse and fragile. "How did this happen? We didn't know. We didn't sign up for this." Her words were filled with anguish, with a plea for some form of understanding, but there was no answer in the night. The silence responded in its own way, as though mocking their desperation. Eleanor didn't know how to comfort her. The truth was that no amount of comforting would ever change what had been set in motion. They were trapped. The land had made its demands clear, and the price was steep. It wasn't just a matter of escape anymore. It was a matter of survival. The question that lingered in the back of Eleanor's mind was whether they could survive at all. The land had not been content with just drawing them in. It had found a way to invade their very thoughts, to poison their souls. Amos, once so full of life, now moved like a puppet, his strings controlled by something far darker than any earthly force. His eyes never left the dark expanse of the field, even as the others began to move. It was as though his body had been taken over, his very essence claimed by the harvest. "What happens now?" Eleanor whispered, though she didn't expect an answer. She wasn't speaking to anyone in particular, but more to the land itself, to the malevolent force that had ensnared them. There was no sound in response, but the wind had begun to stir once more, carrying with it a familiar scent, a sweet, cloying aroma that brought with it a sense of impending doom. "We wait," Amos's voice came, barely above a whisper, and it was as though he had heard Eleanor's unspoken question. "We wait, and we accept what's coming." His words were chilling, and Eleanor felt her stomach twist. This wasn't the man she had known. This was something else. Something had shifted, and she feared it was already too late for him, for all of them. The night was heavy with anticipation. Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing on the edge of something much worse than they had imagined. The figure they had seen earlier wasn't the only thing stirring within the depths of the field. There were other shapes in the dark now, flickering in and out of the corners of her vision. Shadows that didn't belong. Things that moved just out of reach, as though teasing them, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Then, the earth trembled again. But this time, it wasn't just the earth. It was the very sky above them. The sound of 1,000 whispers filled the air, and Eleanor's heart began to race. It was like a chorus of voices, all speaking at once, but the words were indecipherable. The air grew colder still, and Eleanor felt a sharp pressure on her chest, as though the weight of all the souls lost to this place were pressing down on her. Claire's grip on her arm tightened. "What's happening?" she asked, fear evident in her voice. But Eleanor had no answer. The land was speaking to them in a language they couldn't understand, and they were powerless to stop it. The harvest was not just a force of nature. It was a living entity, an ancient being that had learned to feed off of fear, off of silence, off of the very souls that dared to trespass on its land. In the distance, the shadows seemed to converge. The land had begun to stir in earnest now, its true nature revealed. Eleanor and Claire could do nothing but watch as the very soil seemed to warp and twist, creating something monstrous, something that had been waiting for this moment, for the silence to be broken. The harvest had begun, and there was no going back now. The price of silence had been paid, and now the reckoning was upon them. The night, thick with tension, had no mercy. What began as a vague sense of unease had now crystallized into something far more terrifying. The land around them was alive, no longer merely soil and corn, but a breathing entity, pulsating with a dark, primordial energy. Eleanor and Claire stood frozen, their every instinct screaming for them to run, yet their feet remained rooted to the ground. The price of silence had been exacted, and they were now trapped in the aftermath. Amos, once a guiding figure, now seemed little more than a vessel. His eyes were wide, hollow, staring into the heart of the field as if he could see something that the others could not. His body shuddered involuntarily, as if reacting to a force beyond his control. The very air seemed charged with electricity, a buzzing hum that reverberated through their bones. The whispers from earlier had grown louder, now a cacophony of voices that blurred together in a maddening chorus. These were no ordinary sounds. They were ancient, resonating with a sense of finality and hunger. It became clear to Eleanor that the harvest was not a one-time event. It was not a ritual to be completed with a simple offering or sacrifice. It was an ongoing process, one that had roots far deeper than they could have imagined, and one that would continue to claim its victims until it was satisfied. She glanced nervously at the field, where the stalks of corn were now moving of their own accord, swaying as if guided by an invisible hand. It was not the wind. There was no wind. Eleanor's thoughts turned to the past. She remembered the small town, its quiet charm, and the way it had seemed so untouched by the chaos of the world. But there had always been an undercurrent, a subtle hint that something was wrong. Now, that wrongness was emerging in its full, terrifying form. It was as if the earth had been waiting for the right moment to unveil its true nature, to reclaim what it had long been denied. And the cost of that denial was the very lives of those who had dared to trespass. The ground beneath them quaked again, and this time, the movement was unmistakable. The earth was not simply shifting, it was awakening. Eleanor could feel the vibrations in her chest, her heart racing in sync with the tremors. The whispers had reached a fever pitch, filling her mind with images of vast, endless fields of corn, fields that stretched on forever, far beyond the boundaries of the plantation. These weren't just crops. They were the embodiment of the land's insatiable hunger, and they were growing. Claire turned to Eleanor, her face pale, eyes wide with fear. "What do we do?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the noise of the growing storm. It wasn't the kind of storm that one could flee from. It wasn't rain or wind. It was something more primal, more dangerous. "There's no way out. We're stuck here." Eleanor's mind raced. There had to be something they could do. There had to be a way to stop the harvest, to reverse the curse that had taken root in the land. She thought of the figure they had seen earlier, the one that had emerged from the field like a shadow from a forgotten nightmare. Was it a guardian? A harbinger? Or was it something worse, something that had always been there, waiting for the right moment to take hold? In the distance, a flash of light briefly illuminated the field, revealing twisted shapes that rose from the earth itself. The stalks of corn, once upright and orderly, now seemed to writhe as if alive. Some of them were no longer corn at all. They had morphed into grotesque forms, their tendrils stretching toward the sky as if reaching for something just beyond their grasp. The very fabric of reality seemed to bend in the presence of these abominations. The air was thick with the scent of decay now, as though the land itself had begun to rot from within. It was impossible to breathe without tasting the bitter, metallic tang of death. Eleanor felt bile rise in her throat, and she forced herself to focus, to push past the overwhelming wave of panic that threatened to engulf her. They had to fight. They had to survive. Amos remained motionless, his gaze fixed on the epicenter of the field, where the twisted shapes were gathering. His body jerked once, violently, as if something had taken hold of him. A low growl escaped from his throat, primal and guttural. Eleanor knew that the man she had once known was no longer there. Whatever had claimed him was now in full control. "Amos," Eleanor called, her voice shaky but determined. "Amos, fight it." She reached out to him, but he didn't respond. His body moved on its own, stepping toward the cornfield with a strange, hypnotic cadence. It was as if he were being pulled by some invisible force. She reached for him, but Claire stopped her. "No," Claire whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "You can't. He's gone." It was then that Eleanor realized that the harvest wasn't just about crops. It wasn't just about sacrifice. It was about possession. The land didn't merely take lives. It consumed them, twisting them into something else entirely. Amos was no longer human. He had become one with the harvest, a vessel for the land's unholy hunger. Eleanor felt her stomach twist with horror as Amos disappeared into the field, his form swallowed by the corn. It was as though the land had claimed him, and with him, any hope they had left. But there was no time to mourn him. Not now. The harvest was only just beginning, and they were still in its grip. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the cornfield, which had become more than just a patch of crops. It had become a battleground, though neither side seemed to have the advantage. The land, a silent and relentless entity, had already claimed its first victim in Amos, and Eleanor felt the heavy weight of its presence pressing in on her. There was no question anymore. This was no mere superstition. What they were dealing with was far beyond their comprehension, an ancient force that had long been waiting for the right moment to unleash its horrors. Eleanor stood in the midst of the cornfield, trying to shake off the paralyzing fear that clung to her like a second skin. Claire was beside her, but both of them knew they were out of their depth. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening, seeping into their minds, clawing at their sanity. They were not merely voices, but an endless, shifting chorus of forgotten souls, lost, cursed, and seeking release. The very air seemed thick with them, each breath carrying 1,000 unspoken words. "What do we do now?" Claire's voice was barely a murmur, but it cut through the noise like a knife. Her eyes darted nervously, her body tense, as if every step was a risk. "We can't fight this, Eleanor. We're just two people. What can we do against that?" Her hand trembled as she gestured toward the mass of twisted stalks that stretched out before them. Eleanor's mind raced, but it was hard to focus. Every part of her screamed to run, to leave this place and never look back. But the land wouldn't let them go. It had already claimed too much. Amos had fallen, and Eleanor could feel it deep in her bones. Something had shifted. The very soil beneath her feet had become a part of the curse, its roots winding deep into the earth, entwining with something far darker than the land itself. She thought back to the history of this place, to the stories that had been passed down in hushed tones by the older residents. There had been tales of an ancient pact, a bargain made long ago between the settlers and the land itself. It had been a deal for prosperity, for the promise of abundance, but like all bargains with forces beyond understanding, it had come at a steep price. In return for the fertile land, the settlers had agreed to offer up their own, to become a part of the land's eternal harvest. And now, the harvest had come for them. The ground beneath their feet began to tremble again, this time more violently. Eleanor stumbled, catching herself on the nearest corn stalk, which felt unnaturally warm to the touch. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, until they reached a fever pitch. The corn began to move again, not with the wind, but as though it had a will of its own. The stalks swayed, curling and twisting, and Eleanor could see shapes within them, shadowy figures that moved just beyond her reach. They were watching her. Suddenly, the air shifted, thick with a suffocating, foul odor. Eleanor's stomach churned as the scent of decay flooded her senses. The earth had opened, or rather, it had revealed something deep within it, something vast and dark, stretching far beyond the confines of the cornfield. A shadow rose from the earth, coalescing into a figure that was both human and not. Its form was twisted, a grotesque parody of humanity, with limbs that seemed to stretch and bend in unnatural ways. The figure moved toward them with an unnatural speed, its eyes glowing with an unearthly light. Eleanor froze, her heart pounding in her chest. This was no longer just a haunted field. It was the manifestation of something far older, something that had always been there, hiding beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to emerge. It was the true power behind the harvest, the one that had made the original pact, the one that had always been in control. Claire gasped, stepping back instinctively. "What is that thing?" she whispered, her voice trembling with fear. Is it the spirit of the land?" Eleanor couldn't answer. The figure before them was beyond any explanation. It was as though the land itself had given birth to this creature, a being formed of the very soil and roots that had nourished the corn. The whispers rose to a crescendo, and Eleanor could feel the weight of their presence pressing against her mind. They were the voices of those who had been sacrificed, those who had become part of the land, part of the harvest. The creature halted just before them, its eyes locked on Eleanor. She could feel its gaze penetrate her very soul, as if it were searching for something deep within her. She wanted to scream, but the words were stuck in her throat. The thing was not merely observing, it was testing them. It was waiting for something. Then it spoke, not with a voice, but with the very essence of the whispers that had plagued them. "You are not the first to come here," it said, its voice a low, rasping growl that seemed to come from all directions at once. "And you will not be the last." The creature's words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, as if they carried a terrible weight. Eleanor's mind raced as she tried to make sense of what it had said. Not the first. Was this place a trap? Were others drawn to it, like them? Had the land been calling out for years, centuries even, waiting for the right people to stumble into its clutches? In that moment, Eleanor realized the full scope of what they were facing. This was not just a haunted field. This was an ancient living thing, alive with death, hunger, and the need to consume. And there was no escaping it, no running. The land would always reclaim what it was owed, and they were now a part of that cycle, trapped in the roots of its eternal hunger. The creature turned, its form shifting and warping as it retreated into the field, its shape dissolving into the very earth. The whispers slowly began to fade, but the terror remained, gnawing at the edges of Eleanor's mind. It wasn't over. The harvest was far from complete, and the land would never let them go. In the days following their encounter with the creature, Eleanor and Claire had begun to understand the true nature of the curse that gripped the land. The once thriving cornfield had become an oppressive, sentient force, an entity that existed outside of their comprehension. They had made a grave mistake in staying, but leaving had become impossible. Every night, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent, curling through the air like a living thing, urging them to stay, to feed the land. The land had already claimed Amos. Could they escape before it claimed them as well? The terror of that night had left an indelible mark on Eleanor. She could still hear the voice of the creature reverberating in her mind, the promise of eternal harvest, the sickening sensation that she and Claire were already entwined in the earth's insidious grip. The corn, now yellowed and brittle, seemed to watch them, its stalks bending in ways that seemed unnatural, as though the crops were waiting for something, or someone. Each day that passed, the air grew heavier, more suffocating, as though the land itself was tightening its hold around them. Claire had begun to fall ill, her skin pale and drawn, her movements slow and lethargic. Eleanor suspected the land was leeching away her strength, draining her very essence. It was as though the whispers, once distant and haunting, had begun to manifest physically, siphoning the life out of them both. By day, they would try to distract themselves with futile tasks, checking the farm's perimeter, gathering what little food was left, and attempting to maintain some semblance of normalcy. But it was clear that nothing could distract them from the growing horror. It was as if the land had become a parasite, feeding off their fear, their energy. At night, Eleanor would lie awake, her body taut with anxiety, waiting for the inevitable return of the whispers, feeling as if the very walls of the farmhouse were closing in on her. On the third night after their encounter, Eleanor heard it again. A soft rustling, like the whisper of wind, but there was no breeze. The air was still, suffocating. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding, and listened closely. Then, the whispers began, low at first, almost indistinguishable from the sounds of the night. But slowly, they grew louder, clearer, until Eleanor could make out words. Ancient words, unintelligible yet chilling. They were a chant, an incantation that reverberated through her mind. The very fabric of her consciousness seemed to be unraveling. Panic surged within her. She rose from the bed, stumbling to the window, and saw it. The creature, its form no longer a shadow, but an overwhelming mass of shifting darkness, rising from the center of the cornfield. It was as if the earth itself had given birth to this monstrous thing, stretching and writhing as though it were an extension of the land, born from the very soil they had once tilled. Eleanor felt her stomach twist in fear. The creature had returned, but this time it was not alone. Behind it, she saw dozens, no, hundreds of figures, spectral and twisted, their faces contorted in agony. They were the lost souls of the settlers who had made the original pact, their forms bound to the land, eternally trapped in a cycle of death and rebirth. These were the true harvests of the land, the souls that had been claimed by its insatiable hunger. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as the figures moved toward the farmhouse, their eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as she realized what was happening. The land was claiming them now. Claire, sick and weak, lay in her bed, oblivious to the horror outside, but Eleanor knew that it was only a matter of time before the land would come for her too. The harvest had begun in earnest. In the distance, Eleanor saw the ground shifting. The corn stalks began to stir once again, their movement unnatural, as though they had a mind of their own. They bent and twisted, creating a path leading directly toward the farmhouse. The land was drawing them in, its hunger growing insatiable with each passing moment. The figures, no longer just shadows, began to step forward, their bodies jerking and twitching as if they were puppets being pulled by unseen strings. Eleanor's mind raced. What could she do? She had seen the creatures, felt their power. They were not merely spirits, but extensions of the land itself, bound to it by an ancient force. She understood now that there was no escape. The land had already claimed Amos, and it was coming for them. But there was something else, a deeper truth that she had missed before. The creature, the harvest, it was not a random event. This had been the purpose all along. The pact had been made for prosperity, but in exchange, the land would never be satisfied. It would always demand more. Claire stirred in her bed, and Eleanor turned to her, her heart heavy with sorrow. She wanted to run, to flee into the night, but there was nowhere to go. The land would not let them leave. Even if they somehow managed to survive, the land would continue to claim, continuing its endless cycle of life, death, and rebirth. Eleanor's only hope now was to make the truth known, to share their story so that others would know what lay hidden beneath the surface. Maybe someone, someday, would come to break the curse. Or perhaps the land would claim them all in the end. She didn't know how much time she had left. The whispers were growing louder, the figures now approaching the house. Eleanor could hear them scratching at the walls, feeling the oppressive weight of their presence, as though the air itself had thickened. She closed her eyes and whispered a silent prayer, hoping that somehow, someone would hear her. But deep down, she knew the truth. This was the end. The land would never let go. The harvest had come. As the figures drew nearer, their distorted forms casting grotesque shadows upon the farmhouse, Eleanor's mind raced, consumed by a sense of inevitability. The land had always been alive, feeding off the promise of an eternal harvest, drawing energy from the souls that it had claimed. It had waited for years, perhaps even centuries, until it was ready to reap what it had sown. Amos was only the first, a victim of the insatiable hunger that had gripped the earth beneath them. But now, with the curse fully awakened, there was no escape. Eleanor's heart thundered in her chest as she glanced at Claire, still unconscious in her bed, her breathing shallow and labored. The sickness that had plagued Claire for days was not merely illness. It was the land's way of claiming its due. The cornfield, the whispers, the spectral figures, all of it had been a part of a greater plan. The land was not merely alive in the traditional sense. It was an ancient, malevolent force, bound to the very essence of life and death, and it would not be satisfied until it had claimed everything. With each passing second, the presence outside the farmhouse grew stronger, as though the very earth beneath her feet was pulsing with a dark energy. The figures, spectral and grotesque, had now reached the edge of the property, their hollow eyes fixed on the farmhouse with an unyielding hunger. The whispers had become a chorus, their voices merging into a maddening hum, each note a thread in the tapestry of despair that was weaving itself around them. Eleanor had heard of rituals, ancient rites of bargaining with forces beyond understanding, but she had never believed they were real. Now, standing in the dim light of the farmhouse, she understood that the land had a mind of its own, a will that transcended human comprehension. The whispers, the chants, they were not merely sounds. They were words of power, binding words, and Eleanor was beginning to feel the weight of that power pressing in on her. But what could she do? The realization struck her with the force of a hammer. There was no defeating the land. There was no escape from it. The creatures, the souls trapped within the earth, would never be freed. The land had already chosen its next harvest, and that harvest was her. The creatures were its manifestation, its servants, and they would not stop until they had gathered everything that had been promised. Desperation clawed at her chest as she thought of the pact. What had Amos done to bring this curse upon them? Had he known what the land would demand? Had he been a willing participant? Or had he been as deceived as she was? The questions swirled in her mind, but there was no answer. The land did not speak in riddles. It spoke in actions, in the harvest it demanded, in the way it claimed life after life, as though it had always been its right. With trembling hands, Eleanor reached for the old journal she had found in the farmhouse, the one Amos had written in during his time here. The words, now faded and fragile, still held a trace of the truth. As she read, the understanding became clearer. The land was not simply a force of nature. It was an ancient power, one that required sacrifices, one that demanded not just blood, but souls. It had always been that way. The settlers had struck the first deal, and now it was their descendants who would pay the price. A cold sweat covered Eleanor's skin as the full scope of the situation dawned on her. The curse was not just a series of events. It was a cycle, one that would continue for as long as the land was fed. There was no way out. The only choice she had now was whether she would willingly become part of the harvest or whether the land would take her by force. The figures outside had begun to move again, their twisted bodies lurching toward the door. Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest as she realized that they were not here to simply scare her. No, they were here to take what had been promised. The land had come for her, for Claire, and for all those who had been touched by the curse. There was no escaping the harvest now. In the distance, Eleanor saw something she had not noticed before, a light, faint and flickering, emanating from the edge of the cornfield. It was as though the very earth was glowing with a dark, unnatural energy, the light pulsing in rhythm with the whispers. She squinted, trying to make sense of it, but the more she focused, the more the light seemed to dance, to beckon her toward it. It was then that she understood. The land had not simply come for them. It had come for everything, for the very soul of the earth itself. The light, the glow from the cornfield, was the land's final act, the completion of the harvest. Eleanor was not just a victim. She was part of the land's final bargain, its last offering. She had been chosen to complete the cycle. With a final, trembling breath, Eleanor turned toward the door. She knew that once she crossed the threshold, there would be no turning back. The harvest was at hand, and she was its final offering. The land had claimed its due, and all that remained was for her to accept the bargain it had offered. There was no escape. The cycle would continue, and Eleanor would be a part of it forever. The whispers rose again, louder now, a chorus of victory, as she stepped into the darkness of the cornfield. Eleanor stood at the edge of the cornfield, the damp earth cold beneath her feet, as she gazed out over the expanse of twisted stalks that loomed like silent sentinels in the night. The whispers had grown deafening, a constant hum of anticipation that seemed to reverberate through her bones. The air itself felt thick with the weight of the land's presence, pressing in on her with an urgency that was impossible to ignore. The land had waited for so long, too long, and now it was ready to claim its final tribute. She had been chosen, and she knew that there was no escape. The harvest had always been inevitable. She realized a cycle that stretched back beyond human memory, beyond time itself. The settlers, the farmers, the workers, each had been a part of it. Each had played their role in a grand design that was beyond understanding. The land was not merely soil and seed. It was something older, something far darker, something that had existed long before the first human footstep had fallen upon its surface. And now, the cycle had come to its bitter, unyielding conclusion. The figures that had haunted her thoughts and dreams now appeared before her, their forms slowly emerging from the darkness of the field. The creatures, the spirits of those long lost to the land, stood in silent judgment, their hollow eyes fixed upon her. She had once believed they were the twisted remnants of the land's curse, but now she understood that they were its keepers, its guardians, the embodiment of the very essence of the harvest. Their presence was not one of malice, but of duty. They had come to guide her to her fate, to fulfill the pact that had been made so many years ago. Eleanor took a hesitant step forward, her feet moving as though they were no longer her own, drawn toward the heart of the field, where the light still flickered, pulsing like the rhythm of a heartbeat. The whispers were louder now, their words blending together into a single, incoherent chant that filled her mind with visions of the past, of the settlers who had first struck the bargain with the land, of the blood that had been spilled to ensure the earth's eternal fertility. Each offering had been a part of the cycle, and now it was her turn to add her own. The figures moved in tandem with her, their twisted forms shifting through the air with an unnatural grace. They did not speak, but their presence was overwhelming, as though they were communicating with her in a language beyond words. Eleanor could feel the weight of their eyes upon her, the pressure of their gaze pressing down on her shoulders, urging her forward. The land was waiting, and she could not deny its call. As she reached the center of the cornfield, the ground beneath her seemed to tremble, as though the earth itself was alive, aware of the momentous event that was unfolding. The light before her grew brighter, its glow now blinding in its intensity. The whispers were now a chorus, their voices rising in pitch, echoing through the night. And then, just as she felt she could no longer bear the weight of it, a figure appeared before her, a silhouette bathed in the glow of the land's energy. It was Amos. His face was as twisted and contorted as the creatures that surrounded her, but it was unmistakably his. His eyes, hollow and lifeless, met hers with a look that was both familiar and alien. There was no fear in his gaze, no remorse, only the cold, empty certainty of someone who had accepted his fate long ago. He was part of the land now, a servant to its will, and he had come to usher her into the same eternal servitude. "Eleanor," he whispered, his voice a rasping echo that barely carried over the wind. "It was always meant to be this way. You were always meant to be a part of this. The land, it never forgets. It always takes what it is owed." The words sent a chill through her, but Eleanor could not look away. She had known, on some level, that this was the inevitable outcome. She had fought against it, resisted it, but now, standing in the heart of the cursed field, she understood. The land had always been hungry, and its hunger could not be sated until it had taken everything. It had taken Amos, it had taken Claire, and now it would take her. The light grew even brighter, engulfing her in its radiance. The whispers reached a crescendo, their voices becoming a cacophony of sound that threatened to tear her apart. The figures closed in around her, their hands reaching out, their fingers brushing against her skin like the cold touch of death itself. There was no escape, no more resistance. As she closed her eyes, Eleanor finally let go. She allowed herself to be consumed by the light, to be pulled into the embrace of the land. In that moment, she understood the truth of the cycle. There was no breaking it. There was no defying it. The land had always been in control, and she had merely been a small part of its unyielding force. It would continue, long after she was gone, claiming one soul after another, until the earth itself was barren, until the last breath had been taken. And so, with a final, whispered breath, Eleanor became one with the land. The cycle continued, unbroken, as the whispers faded into the night. The harvest was complete, and the land would wait, once again, for its next offering.